Abraham Lincoln, a name that echoes through the corridors of history as the Great Emancipator, the president who led the United States through its darkest days and, above all, freed the slaves. But what if the truth was more complicated? What if Lincoln's real goal wasn't to end slavery, but something else entirely? Today, we dive deep into the mind of one of America's most iconic figures to discover the real reason Abraham Lincoln didn't want to free the slaves. To understand Lincoln's views on slavery, we need to first step back and look at the United States in the mid-1800s, a nation teetering on the brink of collapse. The country was divided into two increasingly hostile camps, the industrializing North and the agrarian South, whose economy was almost entirely dependent on slave labor. The South's economy thrived on the back of enslaved labor, with cotton as its king. Meanwhile, the North, though morally uncomfortable with slavery, was deeply tied to the products of Southern agriculture. This uneasy codependence created an increasingly unstable situation. Yet, for many Americans, especially those in the North, slavery wasn't so much a humanitarian issue as it was a political one. Many feared the economic and political power slavery gave the Southern states, fears that only grew as the country expanded westward. Enter Abraham Lincoln, an ambitious lawyer and politician. Contrary to popular belief, Lincoln wasn't a die-hard abolitionist. In fact, he repeatedly emphasized that he had no intention of interfering with slavery in the states where it already existed. He made this abundantly clear during the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates, which helped catapult him into the national spotlight. During those debates, Lincoln famously said, and I quote, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." This was no slip of the tongue. Lincoln was being strategic. He knew that while slavery was deeply unpopular in the North, many Northerners still didn't want a radical overhaul of the system. They feared what might happen if millions of formerly enslaved people suddenly gained their freedom. But why didn't Lincoln take a stronger moral stance against slavery? Part of the answer lies in the political reality of the time. The United States was a fragile union, constantly negotiating a delicate balance between free and slave states. And that balance was in danger of tipping. Take the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, both attempts to keep the peace by managing the spread of slavery into new territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, proved disastrous. It led to violence in Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces clashed in bloody skirmishes. The failure of these compromises convinced many in the North, including Lincoln, that something had to change. But for Lincoln, that change didn't mean abolishing slavery overnight. Instead, he focused on stopping its expansion. This was a political stance, not a moral crusade. Fast forward to the presidential election of 1860. Lincoln's platform, rooted in halting the spread of slavery, was seen as a direct threat to the Southern way of life. The South didn't care about Lincoln's reassurances that he wouldn't touch slavery where it already existed. They saw his election as the beginning of the end. And so before Lincoln even took office, Southern states began seceding from the Union. The Confederacy was born. For Lincoln, this was the worst possible outcome. His primary goal had always been to preserve the Union at all costs, but now the Union was falling apart, and slavery was at the center of the crisis. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Lincoln's focus was not on freeing slaves, but on reuniting the country. In fact, during the early years of the war, Lincoln was more than willing to let slavery continue in order to bring the southern states back into the fold. In his inaugural address, Lincoln said, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists." It's important to remember this. Lincoln's primary goal, even as war tore the country apart, was not emancipation, but preservation of the Union. In fact, as late as August 1862, over a year into the war, Lincoln wrote to Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, and made his position clear. "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Lincoln wasn't being ambiguous here. He was making a political calculation. The survival of the United States was his top priority, and slavery was a secondary concern. But things were changing. As the war dragged on, it became clear that slavery and the survival of the Union were more intertwined than Lincoln had originally thought. By 1862, the Union was in desperate need of a game changer. That's when Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, which took effect on January 1st, 1863, declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were free. But there's an important caveat. It didn't free a single slave in the border states or in areas of the South already under Union control. Why? Because Lincoln didn't want to alienate the border states or any Southerners who might be willing to return to the Union. In reality, the Emancipation Proclamation was as much a strategic move as it was a moral one. It was designed to weaken the South's war effort, where enslaved people were the backbone of the economy. It was also a bid to discourage foreign powers like Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy, as many European countries had already abolished slavery. Now, here's where things get even more complicated. Even after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln wasn't envisioning a future where black and white Americans lived together as equals. In fact, Lincoln was seriously considering a plan to send freed slaves out of the country entirely. Lincoln had long been an advocate of colonization, essentially a plan to relocate freed African Americans to colonies in Africa or Central America. He met with black leaders to discuss the idea, telling them that the two races could never coexist peacefully in the United States. Lincoln believed that colonization was a way to avoid the potential racial tensions and conflicts that would arise in a post-slavery America. Lincoln's plan never materialized on a large scale, but it's a stark reminder that his views on race and equality were far more complex than his reputation as the Great Emancipator suggests. It wasn't until the final years of the war that Lincoln truly embraced the idea of abolishing slavery nationwide. In 1865, he threw his support behind the 13th Amendment, which officially outlawed slavery throughout the United States. By then, the Civil War was drawing to a close, and Lincoln's priority had shifted from simply preserving the Union to rebuilding it. He recognized that slavery had to be abolished to truly heal the nation's wounds. Tragically, just days after the South's surrender, Lincoln was assassinated, leaving behind a complicated legacy. So, was Abraham Lincoln the Great Emancipator or a reluctant liberator? The answer is both. Lincoln's actions during the Civil War were driven primarily by political necessity, not by an unwavering moral opposition to slavery. He believed in preserving the Union above all else, and emancipation was a means to that end. Yet, his name will forever be tied to the abolition of slavery. even if his journey toward that goal was filled with hesitation, compromise, and political maneuvering.